At 2:53 a.m., Margaret Collins opened the wooden box. Inside, 5 genetically modified insects crawled over each other. She picked one up with surgical tweezers, leaned over the sleeping 7-year-old boy, and gently placed it inside his mouth. Then she whispered, "Sleep, my angel. Your father will hurt a little more tonight." For 3 months, she had been slowly killing Richard Whitmore's son. 7 nannies fled in terror. Doctors found nothing. The billionaire was losing his mind. But Margaret made one mistake. She underestimated the new cleaning lady, a black woman named Amara Johnson, who saw everything others missed. Drop a comment. What city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now take a deep breath. This is going to be a long ride. The 7th nanny didn't even make it to her car. She burst through the front doors of the Whitmore mansion, dragging her suitcase behind her heels, cracking against the marble steps. Her mascara had run down both cheeks. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip her phone. "Pick me up now," she screamed into the receiver. "I don't care where you are. Pick me up now." Richard Whitmore stood in the doorway watching her go. He didn't chase her. He didn't apologize. He didn't even ask what happened. He already knew. The Uber arrived in 4 minutes. The woman threw her suitcase into the back seat, jumped in, and slammed the door. She didn't look back once. 2 days. That was how long she lasted. The one before her made it 3 days. The one before that 5. The very first nanny, a grandmother with 30 years of experience, quit after 1 week and told Richard to institutionalize his son. "That boy is possessed," she had said, her voice trembling. "Something evil lives in that house." Richard closed the front door slowly. Behind him, he heard it again, screaming. His 7-year-old son, Ethan, was screaming from the 2nd floor, the sound tearing through the mansion's 9,000 square feet like a knife through silk. Richard didn't run anymore. 3 months ago, he would have sprinted up those stairs, heart pounding, terrified something had happened to his boy. Now he just climbed the steps slowly, one at a time, because he knew there was nothing he could do. Nothing any doctor could do. Nothing anyone could explain. When Richard pushed open Ethan's bedroom door, he found his son curled into a ball on the floor, clutching his stomach, tears streaming down his pale face. "Daddy," Ethan whimpered. "It hurts. It hurts so bad." Richard knelt beside him and pulled the boy into his arms. Ethan weighed almost nothing now. 10 pounds lost in 3 months. His cheeks were sunken. His eyes had dark circles that made him look like a skeleton. "I know, buddy," Richard whispered. "I know it hurts. Why won't it stop?" Ethan sobbed. Why won't the doctors make it stop? Richard didn't have an answer. He had spent over $200,000 on specialists. MR is at the best hospitals in Austin. CT scans in Houston. Blood work sent to labs across the country. Consultations with neurologists, gastroenterologists, toxicologists, even psychiatrists. Every single one of them said the same thing. "We can't find anything wrong." But something was wrong. Terribly, horrifically wrong. It had started small. Stomach aches after meals. Random vomiting. Fainting spells that came out of nowhere. The doctors blamed food allergies, anxiety, stress from losing his mother 2 years earlier. Then it escalated. Convulsions in the middle of the night. Vomiting blood. His lips turning blue. Episodes where he stopped breathing for 10, 15, 20 seconds, while Richard screamed his name and pounded his chest. Every single night at exactly 3 a.m., like clockwork, like something was scheduled. A soft knock came from the doorway. Richard looked up to see Margaret Collins standing there with a steaming cup in her hands. She was 62 years old, with silver hair pinned back neatly and a face that radiated maternal warmth. "I brought his tea," Margaret said gently. "The chamomile blend. It should help settle his stomach." Richard nodded and took the cup from her hands. Margaret had been with the family for 10 years. She had been there when Richard built his tech company from nothing. She had been there when he married Catherine. She had been there when Ethan was born. And she had been there the night Catherine died. 2 years ago, Catherine Whitmore's car went off a steep road on her way back from Houston. The brakes failed. She crashed through a guardrail and tumbled 200 feet into a ravine. Richard blamed himself for years. He should have serviced the car. He should have insisted she take a different route. He should have told her not to drive at night. Margaret was the one who held him together after the funeral. She was the one who kept the household running. She was the one who raised Ethan while Richard buried himself in work trying to outrun his grief. He trusted her completely. "Thank you, Margaret," Richard said quietly. Margaret smiled and knelt beside Ethan, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Poor sweet boy," she murmured. "You're going to be okay. Margaret's here. Margaret will always be here." Ethan looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Why am I sick?" he whispered. "Did I do something bad?" Margaret's expression flickered something strange, almost satisfied, but it vanished so quickly, Richard thought he imagined it. "Of course not, sweetheart," Margaret said. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's just how the world works." She stood up and turned to Richard. "The tea will help him sleep. I'll check on him again in an hour." Richard nodded. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Margaret." Margaret paused at the doorway. "You'll never have to find out," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." 3 days later, Richard sat in his home office staring at his laptop screen. He had just fired the staffing agency that supplied the nannies. 7 failures in 3 months. None of them could handle Ethan's episodes. None of them could explain what was happening. Half of them thought the house was haunted. Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore, may I make a suggestion?" Richard rubbed his eyes. "Please." "Perhaps we shouldn't hire another nanny," Margaret said. "Clearly they can't handle the pressure, but the house still needs to be maintained. Why not hire someone just for cleaning? Someone who won't be responsible for Ethan directly." Richard considered this. It made sense. Margaret could continue caring for Ethan. She was the only one who seemed capable, and a cleaner could handle the rest. "Fine," Richard said. "Find someone reliable." "I already have someone in mind," Margaret said. "A woman from the service I used before. Quiet, hard-working. She won't cause any problems." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Do whatever you think is best." Margaret smiled. "I always do." Amara Johnson arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She was 29 years old, with dark skin, sharp brown eyes that seemed to notice everything, and black hair tied into a neat bun. She wore a simple uniform, black pants, white blouse, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect. Richard barely looked at her when Margaret introduced them. "This is Amara," Margaret said. "She'll be handling the cleaning from now on." "Fine," Richard muttered, already walking away. "Just stay out of Ethan's room when he's having an episode." Amara nodded once. "Yes, sir." She didn't ask questions. She didn't make small talk. She simply started working. But from the very first hour, something was different about her. Margaret noticed it immediately. While most cleaning staff move mechanically through their tasks, Amara moved with purpose. Her eyes swept across every room, cataloging details, filing away information. When she passed Ethan's bedroom door, she paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough to listen. Margaret watched her from the end of the hallway, her expression unreadable. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., Ethan's screams tore through the mansion again. Richard burst into the room to find his son convulsing on the bed, foam bubbling from his lips. His eyes rolled back into his head. "Ethan!" Richard shouted. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Margaret rushed in behind him, already holding a damp cloth and the cup of calming tea. "Hold him still," Margaret instructed. "I'll wipe his face. This will pass. It always does." But this time, someone else appeared in the doorway. Amara. She stood there in her nightclothes, her eyes wide, but not with fear, with calculation, with analysis. "What are you doing here?" Richard snapped. "I told you to stay away during episodes." "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore," Amara said quietly. "I heard the screams. I wanted to make sure—" "Get out," Margaret interrupted sharply. "This is none of your concern." Amara's eyes flickered to Margaret. Something passed between them. Something cold. Then Amara nodded and stepped back into the hallway. But she didn't leave. Richard didn't notice he was too focused on Ethan, but Margaret did. She saw Amara standing just outside the door watching, listening, processing. Over the next several days, Richard noticed something strange. Amara was always nearby during Ethan's episodes. She reorganized the linen closet outside his room. She polished the windows in the hallway. She dusted the banister near his door. Always watching, always listening. Richard should have found it invasive. He should have fired her for crossing boundaries. But something about her attention wasn't predatory. It was methodical, like she was solving a puzzle everyone else had given up on. One Tuesday afternoon, Richard came home early from a meeting. He walked through the front door and stopped dead. Ethan was sitting on the living room couch, eating cookies, talking, laughing. Amara sat beside him, her cleaning supplies abandoned nearby, listening intently as Ethan explained something with wild hand gestures. And then the T-Rex tried to bite him, but the Spinosaurus was like, whoosh, and knocked him over, Ethan said excitedly. "Did you know the Spinosaurus could swim? Most people think T-Rex is the strongest, but that's not even true." Amara smiled. "I didn't know that. You're very smart, Ethan." Ethan beamed. Richard stood frozen in the doorway. He hadn't seen his son smile in months. "Mikey." Richard's voice cracked. You're feeling okay?" Ethan looked up, still grinning. "Daddy Amara says dinosaurs are cooler than superheroes. She's wrong, but she's nice." Amara stood, immediately smoothing her uniform. "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore. He asked me to sit with him and I—" "No." Richard interrupted, his throat tight. "No, it's fine. It's good." He stared at his son, a live, animated present, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. But that night, the horror returned. At 3 a.m. exactly, Ethan's screams shattered the silence. Richard sprinted upstairs and found his son worse than ever. Convulsions so violent his body lifted off the mattress, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, his skin turning gray. "Oh, God," Richard gasped. "Oh, God, Ethan." Margaret rushed in with her tea and cloth. "Hold him," she commanded. "Hold him still. Let me help." Amara appeared in the doorway, already moving toward the bed. Margaret's head snapped toward her. "I told you to stay out." "His airway," Amara said sharply. "Check his airway." Richard looked at her. "What?" Amara pushed past Margaret and grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight. "Open his mouth," she said to Richard. "Now." Something in her voice, the authority, the certainty, made him obey without question. He pried Ethan's jaw open. Amara shone the light into his throat, and then her face went white. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered. "You need to see this." Richard leaned over his son. The beam from Amara's phone illuminated something at the back of Ethan's throat. Something moving. Something dark. Something alive. "What the hell is that?" Richard choked. Amara didn't hesitate. She ran to her cleaning cart in the hallway, grabbed a pair of metal tweezers and a glass jar, and returned in seconds. "Hold him still," she ordered. Richard pinned Ethan's shoulders to the mattress as Amara reached into the boy's throat with steady, practiced hands. When she pulled out the object, Richard's entire world collapsed. A large, dark, twitching insect fell into the glass jar. Ethan's convulsions stopped immediately. His breathing steadied. His color returned. Richard stared at Amara in horror. "How?" he gasped. "How did you know?" Amara sealed the jar, her hands trembling now that the crisis had passed. "Because this wasn't the first time," she said quietly. She turned and looked directly at Margaret, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face completely blank. "And that insect," Amara continued, her voice like ice, "did not crawl into his mouth on its own." The room fell silent. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Something cold, something ancient, something hungry. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office, staring at the glass jar on his desk, watching the insect crawl in circles. His mind was racing, but his thoughts kept hitting the same wall. Someone put that thing in my son's throat. Someone has been poisoning him for 3 months. Someone in this house. Around 4 a.m. Amara knocked on his office door. "Mr. Whitmore, may I speak with you?" Richard nodded and gestured for her to sit. Amara closed the door behind her and took the chair across from his desk. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she said, "Before I worked as a cleaner, I was a licensed emergency room nurse." Richard looked up sharply. "What? 5 years at Austin Memorial?" Amara continued. "I lost my license after I reported a negligence cover-up. A patient died because a doctor made a mistake and the hospital tried to bury it. I wouldn't stay quiet." She paused. "They retaliated. Had my license revoked. Blacklisted me from every hospital in Texas." Richard stared at her. "You were a nurse?" Amara nodded. "When I first heard Ethan's symptoms, something felt familiar. The convulsions, the vomiting, the timing. It reminded me of poisoning cases I'd seen in the ER. But I couldn't prove anything. I needed evidence." She looked at the jar on his desk. "Now we have it." Richard's hands were shaking. "Who?" he whispered. "Who would do this to my son?" Amara hesitated. "Someone with access to him every night," she said carefully. "Someone who prepares his food. Someone who gives him tea before bed and insists he drink it." Richard's stomach dropped. "No." "Someone who has been with this family for 10 years, Amara continued. "Someone who stayed when 7 nannies ran away screaming. Someone who benefits if you become dependent on her." "No." Richard shook his head violently. "Margaret would never. She's been with us since before my wife died. She took care of Catherine when she—" He stopped. The words died in his throat. Amara watched him, her expression pained but unwavering. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to find out the truth. Whatever that truth is." Richard sat motionless for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. "I need 3 hidden cameras installed," he said into the receiver. "My son's bedroom. Tonight. Nobody can know." The next morning, Richard drove the insect to 3 different experts in Austin. A private lab, an exotic animal veterinarian, a biology professor at the University of Texas. Every single one of them said the same thing. It wasn't a Texas insect. It wasn't even American. It was a Madagascar hissing cockroach hybrid, genetically modified and capable of releasing a toxic secretion when agitated. The toxin matched Ethan's symptoms exactly: nausea, convulsions, internal bleeding, respiratory distress, hallucinations. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't environmental. Someone had deliberately imported these insects. Someone had deliberately placed them inside his son's mouth. For months. Richard sat in his car outside the university lab, staring at the analysis report. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Margaret's face kept appearing in his mind, her warm smile, her soothing voice, her comforting presence during every single one of Ethan's episodes. "You'll never have to find out. I'm not going anywhere." He had trusted her completely. He had trusted her with his son's life. And if Amara was right, if Margaret was the one behind this, then Richard had been living with a monster for 10 years. a monster who had watched his son scream and convulse and nearly die night after night after night. A monster who had held Ethan's hand and whispered comfort while slowly killing him. Richard drove home in silence. Tonight the cameras would reveal everything. Tonight he would finally learn the truth. And if Margaret Collins had been poisoning his son, Richard would make sure she never hurt another child again, even if it destroyed him in the process. Richard arrived home just as the sun began to set. The security team had already finished installing the cameras. 3 devices completely invisible to anyone who didn't know they were there. One disguised as a smoke detector on the ceiling. One hidden inside a lamp on Ethan's nightstand. And a micro camera embedded in the stuffed dinosaur Ethan had slept with since he was 3 years old. Amara met Richard at the back door, away from Margaret's view. "It's done," she whispered. "The feed goes directly to your laptop in the office. Night vision activated automatically after dark." Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "Where's Margaret now?" "Kitchen, preparing dinner." Amara paused. "She asked about you. Said you seemed distracted this morning." "What did you tell her?" "That you had business meetings all day." Amara studied his face. "Mr. Whitmore, are you okay?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "My son has been slowly dying for 3 months. I just found out someone has been putting genetically modified insects down his throat. And the only suspect is a woman I've trusted for 10 years. He shook his head. "No, Amara. I am very far from okay." Amara didn't offer empty comfort. She simply said, "Tonight we'll know the truth." Richard looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life barely 2 weeks ago and had already done more than 7 nannies and a dozen doctors combined. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. "You could have walked away. You could have minded your own business. Why risk getting involved?" Amara was silent for a moment. "Because I know what it's like to see something wrong and have no one believe you," she said finally. "When I reported that doctor at the hospital, everyone told me to stay quiet. They said I was imagining things. They said I was causing trouble." Her voice hardened. "A man died because people chose comfort over truth. I won't make that mistake again." She met Richard's eyes directly. "Your son is dying, Mr. Whitmore. I don't care about the risk. I care about saving that little boy." Richard swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You can repay me by believing whatever those cameras show us tonight," Amara replied, "even if it destroys everything you thought you knew." Richard nodded slowly. He was terrified of what he might see, but he was more terrified of letting his son die while the truth hid in plain sight. The evening passed with excruciating slowness. Richard forced himself to eat dinner at the table with Ethan and Margaret, acting as normal as possible. Every bite of food tasted like ash. Every word Margaret spoke made his skin crawl. "You seem tense, Richard," Margaret said, tilting her head with concern. "Is everything all right at work?" Richard gripped his fork tighter. "Fine. Just a lot on my mind." "You work too hard." Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand. "You need to take care of yourself. Ethan needs his father healthy and strong." Richard pulled his hand away, pretending to reach for his water glass. "I'm fine, Margaret." Ethan pushed his food around his plate, barely eating. "Not hungry, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "My tummy hurts again." Margaret stood up immediately. "I'll make you some tea. The special blend. It always helps." Richard watched her walk to the kitchen, his heart pounding so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. The special tea. The tea she made every single night. The tea she insisted Ethan drink before bed. Amara entered the dining room to clear the plates, her eyes meeting Richard's for just a moment. A silent message passed between them. Tonight. At 8 o'clock, Margaret brought Ethan his tea. Richard watched from the hallway as she handed the cup to his son. Watched as Ethan drank it, obediently. watched as Margaret smoothed the blankets over him and kissed his forehead. "Sleep well, my sweet boy," Margaret murmured. "I'll check on you later." She turned and saw Richard standing there. "He's settled," she said with a warm smile. "Poor thing is exhausted. Hopefully tonight will be peaceful." Richard forced himself to nod. Hopefully. Margaret walked past him toward her room on the first floor, pausing to look back. "You should get some rest too, Richard. You look terrible." "I will," he lied. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night." Richard waited until he heard her door close. Then he went to his office where Amara was already waiting. The laptop was open on his desk, showing a black and white feed of Ethan's bedroom. The night vision made everything glow an eerie green. Ethan was already asleep, his small body barely visible under the covers, his chest rising and falling steadily. "Now we wait," Amara said quietly. Richard pulled up a chair beside her. The hours crawled by. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 in the morning. Richard's eyes burned from staring at the screen. Amara brought him coffee black, and they sat in tense silence watching his son sleep. "Maybe I was wrong," Amara whispered around 2:30. "Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe—" "Shh." Richard leaned forward. "Look." On the screen, Ethan's bedroom door was opening. Slowly. Silently. A figure stepped inside. Margaret Collins. She was wearing a pale nightgown, her feet bare, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had done this many, many times before. In her left hand, she carried a small wooden box. Richard stopped breathing. Margaret walked to Ethan's bedside and stood perfectly still, staring down at the sleeping boy. 1 full minute passed. She didn't move. She just watched him, her expression hidden from the camera angle. Then she opened the box. The night vision captured it with horrifying clarity. 5 large insects crawled inside their bodies, twitching antennae waving. Richard's stomach lurched. "Oh my God," he whispered. Margaret picked up one of the insects with a pair of surgical tweezers she pulled from her pocket. She leaned over Ethan's sleeping form and gently, almost tenderly, parted his lips. With the precision of a surgeon, she placed the insect inside his mouth. Richard shot to his feet, knocking his chair backward. "I have to stop her," he gasped. "I have to—" Amara grabbed his arm. "Wait. She's killing him. We need everything on camera," Amara said, her voice shaking but firm. "We need proof. Undeniable proof. If you confront her now without the full recording, she could claim we edited it. She could say we set her up. We need to see everything." Richard's entire body was trembling. Every instinct screamed at him to run upstairs and tear that woman away from his son. But Amara was right. They needed the whole truth. On the screen, Margaret waited until the insect disappeared into Ethan's throat. Then, she stroked his hair, the gesture so loving it made Richard want to vomit. And then she spoke. The laptop's microphone picked up every word. "Sleep, my angel," Margaret whispered. "Your father will hurt a little more tonight. And when he finally breaks, I'll be the one he needs." She paused, her hand still resting on Ethan's head. "I always have been." Richard couldn't take it anymore. He tore out of the office and ran. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his lungs burning, his vision blurring with rage and horror and grief. He burst through Ethan's door so hard it slammed against the wall. Margaret was still standing beside the bed. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't even look surprised. She simply turned to face him, the wooden box still in her hands. "Richard," she said softly. "Not Mr. Whitmore. Richard. Like a lover. Like a partner. Like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time." "Get away from my son," Richard growled. Margaret didn't move. Amara rushed in behind him, immediately going to Ethan. She pulled the boy from the bed, checked his throat, found the insect before it could burrow deeper, and extracted it with the tweezers she'd brought. Ethan coughed and sputtered, but didn't wake fully, still sedated by whatever Margaret had put in his tea. "He's okay," Amara said breathlessly. "I got it. He's going to be okay." She wrapped Ethan in a blanket and carried him toward the door. "I'm taking him to the guest room," she said to Richard. "Away from her. Call the police. Now." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving Margaret. The bedroom fell silent as Amara's footsteps faded down the hallway. Just Richard and Margaret now. Two people who had shared a home for 10 years. Two people who were suddenly strangers. "Why?" Richard's voice cracked. "Why would you do this to him? He's a child. He's 7 years old. He never did anything to you." Margaret placed the wooden box on Ethan's dresser, almost tenderly, like it was something precious. "You really don't remember," she said quietly. "Remember what—" Margaret turned to face him fully, and for the first time Richard saw something in her eyes he had never noticed before. Hunger, obsession, madness. 10 years, Richard. I gave this family 10 years. I cooked your meals. I cleaned your house. I raised your son when you were too busy with work. I held you when your wife died." Her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. "And you pretend you never saw me. You pretend you never touched me." Richard's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Margaret stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. 3 years ago, she said. "The night Catherine went to Houston for that conference. The night you drank too much whiskey in the library. The night you told me your marriage was falling apart." Richard's stomach dropped. He remembered that night. He had been depressed, fighting with Catherine constantly, feeling like a failure as a husband and father. He'd been drinking alone when Margaret brought him dinner. And in a moment of weakness, of stupid drunken weakness, he had said things he shouldn't have said. He had kissed her. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before he pulled away, horrified at himself. He apologized the next morning. He told her it was a mistake. He told her it could never happen again. To him, it was a shameful error in judgment. To Margaret, apparently, it was something else entirely. That kiss meant nothing. Richard said, his voice shaking. "I was drunk. I apologized. I made it clear." "You told me Catherine didn't understand you." Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "You told me you felt seen by me. You told me you were unhappy. You told me you wished things were different." "I was drunk," Richard shouted. "I said stupid things I didn't mean. People say things when they're drinking. It wasn't real." "It was real to me." Margaret's face twisted with a pain that looked almost genuine. "Do you know what it's like to love someone for 10 years and watch them pretend you don't exist? Do you know what it's like to be invisible in your own home?" "I was there for everything, Richard. Every triumph, every failure, every moment, and you treated me like furniture." "You were my employee," Richard said desperately. "It was inappropriate. I was wrong to kiss you, but that didn't mean I loved you. It didn't mean I wanted anything from you." "You did love me," Margaret insisted. "You just didn't know it yet. Catherine was in the way. She was always in the way." Richard felt like the floor was tilting beneath him. "Catherine," he whispered. "What does Catherine have to do with this?" Margaret smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Richard had ever seen. "I waited for you, Richard. After that night in the library, I waited. I thought you would come to your senses. I thought you would realize that Catherine was wrong for you, and I was right. But you just went back to her. You went back to your miserable marriage like nothing happened." She took another step closer. "And then she died. And I thought finally you would see me. Finally you would need me." Richard's legs felt like they might collapse. "Margaret, what did you do?" "I freed you." The words hung in the air like poison. Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she was saying. "Catherine's death was an accident," he choked out. "The brakes failed. The car went off the road. It was an accident." Margaret shook her head slowly. "The brakes didn't fail on their own, Richard. No, 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 no. I cut the brake lines 3 days before her trip. Margaret continued, her voice calm, almost clinical. I knew she took that steep road every Thursday. I calculated the exact spot where she would lose control, the curve where the guardrail was weakest. Richard grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. You killed her, he gasped. You murdered my wife. I removed an obstacle, Margaret corrected. She didn't deserve you. You said so yourself. You were miserable with her. I was drunk. Richard screamed, tears streaming down his face now. I loved her. She was my wife, the mother of my son. And you... He couldn't finish the sentence. 2 years. For 2 years he had blamed himself for Catherine's death. He should have checked the car. He should have insisted on a different route. He should have done anything to prevent the accident. But there was no accident. There was only Margaret. Waiting, planning, killing. I did it for us, Margaret said softly. I did it because I love you. This isn't love, Richard spat. This is insanity. You killed my wife and then you tried to kill my son. What kind of monster does that? Margaret's expression flickered with something like hurt. I wasn't trying to kill Ethan. I was just making you need me more. Every time he got sick, you leaned on me. Every time he screamed, I was the one who comforted him. Every time a nanny ran away, I was the one who stayed. She spread her hands as if presenting a gift. I was making myself indispensable, Richard. I was showing you that I'm the only one who will never leave. The only one who will always be here. Richard stared at her in horror. She actually believed what she was saying. She had convinced herself that slowly poisoning a child was an act of love, that murdering a woman was removing an obstacle, that 10 years of obsession entitled her to a man who had never wanted her. The police are on their way, Richard said, his voice hollow. Amara called them. They'll have seen everything on the cameras. It's over Margaret. Margaret's smile faded. The cameras, she repeated. Every word, every action. They recorded it all. For the first time, something like fear flickered across Margaret's face, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a strange calm. It doesn't matter, she said quietly. Even if they lock me up, you'll never forget me. Every time you look at Ethan, you'll think of me. Every time you drive past that road where Catherine died, you'll think of me. I'll be in your head forever, Richard. That's its own kind of marriage. Richard's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted to grab her by the throat and squeeze until the light left her eyes, the way the light had left Catherine's eyes in that crumpled car at the bottom of the ravine. But he didn't. Because downstairs, his son was waiting. His son, who had almost died because Richard trusted the wrong person. His son, who needed a father, not a murderer. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Margaret turned her head toward the window, listening. They're almost here, she said calmly. I suppose this is goodbye. Richard shook his head. I hope you rot in prison. I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life remembering what you did. And I hope it destroys you. Margaret looked at him with something almost like pity. You still don't understand, Richard. I'm not the one who's destroyed. She gestured around the room at Ethan's empty bed, at the wooden box of insects, at the life she had shattered piece by piece. You are. The front door burst open downstairs. Heavy footsteps, shouting. Police! Everyone stay where you are! Richard stepped back from Margaret as 2 officers rushed into the room, their weapons drawn. Margaret didn't resist. She held out her wrists, letting them cuff her without a struggle. As they led her toward the door, she turned back one last time. I'll be thinking of you, Richard, she said softly. Every single day. Then she was gone. Richard stood alone in his son's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of 3 months of horror. The wooden box on the dresser, the rumpled sheets where Ethan had nearly died, the invisible cameras that had captured the truth. He sank to his knees and wept. For Catherine, who deserved so much more than the death she received. For Ethan, who had suffered for sins that were never his. For himself and the blindness that had nearly cost him everything. He didn't know how long he knelt there before Amara appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She simply walked over, knelt beside him, and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Ethan's okay," she said quietly. "He's sleeping in the guest room. One of the paramedics checked him. His vitals are stable." Richard couldn't speak. He just nodded. "The police want to take your statement," Amara continued. "They have questions. About Margaret. About Catherine. About everything." Richard looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "She killed my wife," he whispered. "She killed Catherine, and I never knew. I lived with her for 2 years after the murder. I thanked her for her support. I told her I couldn't survive without her." Amara's grip on his shoulder tightened. "You didn't know. Nobody knew. That's not your fault." "Isn't it?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I kissed her, Amara. One stupid drunken kiss and it started everything. If I had never touched her, Catherine might still be alive. Ethan might never have gotten sick. Or Margaret might have found another trigger," Amara said firmly. "People like her don't need a reason. They create reasons. They twist reality until it fits their obsession. You made a mistake, yes. But her actions are not your responsibility." Richard wanted to believe her. He wasn't sure he could. The next several hours were chaos. Police interviews, forensic teams, evidence collection, detectives asking Richard to explain everything from that drunken night 3 years ago to the present day. He told them about the kiss, about Margaret's behavior afterward, about Catherine's death and how he had accepted it as an accident, about Ethan's mysterious illness that no doctor could diagnose. He told them about Amara, how she had noticed things everyone else missed, how she had identified the insect, how she had suggested the cameras. The detective in charge, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, listened to everything without interrupting. When Richard finished, she nodded slowly. "We've already sent the insect samples to the lab," she said. "The camera footage is being processed as evidence. Based on what we have, Margaret Collins will be charged with first-degree murder for your wife's death and attempted murder for your son." Richard closed his eyes. "Will it be enough? Will she actually go to prison?" "With this evidence." The detective almost smiled. "She'll never see the outside of a cell again." By dawn, the mansion was empty. The police were gone. The forensic team was gone. Margaret was gone, locked in a holding cell somewhere downtown. Only Richard, Amara, and Ethan remained. Richard found Amara in the kitchen making coffee. Her hands were shaking slightly, the first sign of vulnerability he had seen from her since this nightmare began. "You should sleep," Richard said quietly. Amara shook her head. "I don't think I can. Every time I close my eyes, I see her standing over his bed." Richard understood completely. He would be seeing that image for the rest of his life. "I need to ask you something," he said. Amara looked up. "Why did you really stay?" Richard asked. "That first night when you heard Ethan screaming, you could have ignored it. You could have told yourself it wasn't your problem. But you didn't. You stood outside his door and listened. You watched. You investigated." Amara was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 12 years old," she said finally, "my younger brother got sick. Same thing, mysterious symptoms, no diagnosis. My parents took him to doctor after doctor. Nobody could figure out what was wrong." She poured the coffee, her hands steadier now. "Turned out our neighbor had been poisoning the water supply in our apartment building. He was angry about something, I don't even remember what. My brother nearly died before anyone figured it out." Amara handed Richard a cup. "When I heard Ethan screaming that first night, something in my gut told me this wasn't a natural illness. The timing was too precise. The symptoms were too specific. It felt like my brother all over again." She met Richard's eyes. "I couldn't walk away. Not when I knew what might be happening. Not when I had a chance to stop it." Richard stared at her, this woman who had lost her career for doing the right thing, who had been blacklisted and forced to clean houses for a living, who had risked everything to save a child she barely knew. "I'm going to help you get your nursing license back," he said quietly. Amara blinked. "What?" "I have resources, lawyers, connections. Whatever it takes to clear your name and get you reinstated, I'll do it." "Mr. Whitmore, that's not—" "Richard," he interrupted. "Call me Richard. And it's not charity. It's not payment. It's just the right thing to do." Amara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. For the first time since they met, she smiled. It was small, tired, barely there, but it was real. "Okay," she said softly. "Richard." They stood in the kitchen as the sun rose, drinking coffee in exhausted silence. In the guest room upstairs, Ethan slept peacefully for the first time in 3 months. Outside, the world continued spinning, indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded in this mansion. But inside, something had shifted. The monster was gone. The truth was finally exposed. And somehow, impossibly, there was still hope. Richard didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to explain any of this to Ethan. He didn't know how to process the fact that the woman he trusted had murdered his wife and tortured his son. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was never going to let anyone hurt his family again, no matter what it cost him. The days that followed Margaret's arrest blurred together in a fog of exhaustion and grief. Richard barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret standing over Ethan's bed, the wooden box in her hands, the insects crawling inside. He saw Catherine's car tumbling off that cliff, brakes failing because someone had cut the lines. He saw 10 years of shared meals and quiet conversations and trusted moments, all of it poisoned by obsession he never saw coming. Ethan mercifully didn't fully understand what had happened. Richard told him that Margaret had done something very bad and had to go away. He told him the sickness was over now that the doctors finally found the problem, that everything would be okay. Ethan accepted this with the simple faith of a 7-year-old. "Will I still have bad dreams?" he asked Richard on the 3rd morning after Margaret's arrest. Richard pulled his son into his arms and held him tight. "Maybe sometimes," he said honestly. "But I'll be right here, and the bad dreams will get smaller and smaller until they go away completely." Ethan nodded against his father's chest. "Is Amara staying?" he asked quietly. Richard hesitated. He hadn't discussed this with Amara, hadn't even thought about what came next. "Do you want her to stay?" Richard asked. Ethan pulled back and looked up at his father with serious eyes. "She makes me feel safe," he said. "Like Mom used to." Richard's throat tightened. "Then I'll ask her to stay." That evening, Richard found Amara in the kitchen packing her small bag. His heart dropped. "You're leaving?" Amara looked up startled. Margaret's gone. Ethan is safe. You don't need a cleaning lady anymore." "I don't need a cleaning lady," Richard agreed. "But Ethan needs you. And honestly," he paused, searching for the right words, "I need you too." Amara set down the shirt she was folding. "Mr. Whitmore." "Richard." "Richard." She took a breath. "I don't want to overstay my welcome. I don't want to be another person taking advantage of your situation." "Taking advantage?" Richard almost laughed. "Amara, you saved my son's life. You uncovered a murder that went unsolved for 2 years. You did what doctors and police and 7 nannies couldn't do. That's not taking advantage. That's—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish. Amara watched him carefully. "That's what?" she asked. "A miracle," Richard said quietly. "You're a miracle." Amara's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. "I'm not a miracle. I'm just someone who paid attention." "Then stay," Richard said. "Not as an employee, not as hired help. Just stay. Help Ethan heal. Help me figure out how to move forward. I'll pay you whatever you want, set you up in the guest suite, cover your nursing school if you want to go back. Whatever you need." Amara was quiet for a long moment. "I'll stay," she said finally. "But not for the money. I'll stay because that little boy upstairs has been through hell, and he deserves to have people around him who actually care about his well-being." Richard nodded, relief flooding through him. "Thank you." Amara picked up her bag and set it aside. "But I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "First, I'm not your employee. I'm not going to clean your house or cook your meals. I'll help with Ethan, but I'm not a servant." "Agreed." "Second, we're going to get Ethan into therapy. Real therapy with a licensed child psychologist. He's going to need professional help processing what happened." "Already planned," Richard said. "I have an appointment scheduled for next week." Amara nodded approvingly. "Third, you're going to take care of yourself. I've watched you for the past 3 days. You're not eating. You're not sleeping. You're running on guilt and adrenaline, and that's not sustainable." Richard started to argue, but Amara held up her hand. "I'm serious. Ethan needs his father healthy and present, not a shell of a man who's drowning in self-blame." Richard let out a long breath. "I don't know how to stop blaming myself," he admitted. "If I hadn't kissed her that night—" "Stop." Amara's voice was firm. "Margaret Collins made her own choices. You made a mistake, a human mistake. But she chose to become a murderer. She chose to poison a child. Those decisions are hers, not yours." Richard wanted to believe her. He wasn't sure he could, but for Ethan's sake, he would try. The next 2 weeks were filled with interviews, depositions, and endless meetings with lawyers. The district attorney assigned to Margaret's case was a woman named Sandra Chen, a prosecutor with a reputation for never losing a case. She sat across from Richard in his living room, a thick file spread on the coffee table between them. "We have overwhelming evidence," Sandra said. "The camera footage alone would be enough to convict her. But combined with the insect analysis, the medical records, and the forensic examination of your wife's car, we're looking at multiple life sentences." Richard nodded numbly. "What about Catherine? Can you prove she tampered with the brakes?" Sandra opened one of the folders. The original accident investigation was inconclusive. They noted the brake failure but couldn't determine a cause. "We've reopened the case with new forensic techniques." She pulled out a photograph. "These are tool marks on the brake lines. They were overlooked 2 years ago, but our experts confirmed they're consistent with deliberate cutting." Richard stared at the photograph. His wife's death reduced to scratches on a metal tube. "There's something else," Sandra said carefully. "We searched Margaret's room at the mansion. We found items." Richard looked up. "What kind of items?" Sandra hesitated. "Photographs of you. Hundreds of them going back years. Pictures she took without your knowledge, you sleeping, you working, you playing with Ethan. She also kept a journal." She pulled out a thick notebook with a worn leather cover. "We've already logged it as evidence, but I thought you should know what's inside." Richard reached for the journal, then stopped. "Tell me," he said. "I'm not sure I can read it myself." Sandra opened the notebook and began summarizing. "It starts about 4 years ago. At first, it's just observations about you, your schedule, your habits, your favorite foods. But after that night in the library, it becomes obsessive." She turned several pages. "She writes about the moment you finally saw me. She interprets the kiss as a declaration of love. She writes about her plans to remove the obstacle, her words, and make you realize you belong together." Richard felt sick. "She planned Catherine's murder for months," Sandra continued. "She researched brake systems. She studied the route Catherine took every Thursday. She even tested the method on her own car first in an empty parking lot to make sure it would work." "Oh God," Richard whispered. "After Catherine's death, she expected you to turn to her for comfort. When you didn't, when you remained distant and professional, she became frustrated. The journal entries from that period are increasingly erratic." Sandra turned more pages. "That's when she decided to use Ethan." Richard's head snapped up. "Use him how?" She reasoned that if Ethan became severely ill, you would need her more than ever. She would be the one caring for him, comforting him, nursing him through the crisis. And eventually, when you were broken down enough, you would see her as your savior. Sandra closed the journal. She ordered the insects from an illegal exotic animal dealer online. She researched their toxic properties. She calculated exactly how much exposure Ethan could withstand. Without dying, she needed him sick, not dead. Richard buried his face in his hands. "She was torturing my son to manipulate me," he said, his voice muffled. "She watched him scream and convulse and vomit blood, and it was all just strategy." "I'm sorry," Sandra said quietly. "I know this is difficult to hear." "Difficult." Richard looked up, his eyes blazing. "Difficult is a work deadline. Difficult is a flat tire. This is evil. Pure calculated evil." Sandra nodded. "Which is exactly why we're pursuing the maximum sentence. Margaret Collins will never hurt anyone again." The trial began 6 weeks later. Richard sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day, Amara beside him. Ethan stayed home with a trusted caregiver. He was too young to witness what was about to unfold. Margaret Collins was escorted in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her silver hair now streaked with gray roots, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller, somehow, diminished without the comfortable surroundings of the mansion. But when her eyes found Richard across the courtroom, something flickered in them. Not remorse, not fear, anticipation. She was actually enjoying this. Richard's stomach turned. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The camera footage was shown to the jury, 12 men and women who watched in visible horror as Margaret placed the insect into Ethan's mouth. Several jurors looked away. One woman in the back row started crying. The forensic experts testified about the insects. They explained how they were genetically modified, how their toxins affected the human body, how someone would need specialized knowledge to obtain and handle them. The medical records were presented. Months of test results showing nothing because the doctors were looking for the wrong things. Ethan's weight loss, his declining vitals, his countless episodes, all documented in clinical detail. Then came the evidence about Catherine. The reopened accident investigation. The tool marks on the brake lines. The expert testimony confirming deliberate tampering. The timeline that placed Margaret alone at the house with access to Catherine's car in the days before her death. And finally, Margaret's journal. Sandra Chen read excerpts aloud, her voice steady and controlled. "Today I watched him from the garden. He was playing with Ethan by the pool laughing. That laugh should be for me. Soon it will be. Catherine doesn't deserve him. She's cold and distant. She doesn't see him like I do. She doesn't love him like I do. One day she'll be gone, and he'll finally understand. The brake lines are so fragile. Just a few cuts in the right places. She'll never know what happened. No one will. It's done. The obstacle is removed. Now I wait. Now I heal him. Now he turns to me." Richard gripped the armrest of his seat, his knuckles white. Beside him, Amara placed her hand over his. "Breathe," she whispered. "Just breathe." Margaret's defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity. He claimed Margaret suffered from erotomania, a delusional disorder that made her believe Richard loved her. He called psychiatric experts who testified about obsessive attachment and romantic delusions. But it wasn't enough. The jury didn't care why Margaret did what she did. They cared that she did it. On the final day of testimony, Margaret took the stand. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Her attorney walked her through scripted questions trying to paint her as a victim of mental illness, someone who couldn't control her actions. But then the prosecutor stood up for cross-examination. Sandra Chen approached the witness stand slowly. "Ms. Collins, you testified that you believed Richard Whitmore was in love with you. Is that correct?" "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "He told me so." "He told you he loved you?" "Not in those exact words, but I knew. A woman knows." Sandra nodded. "And yet after that night in the library, the night you claim he declared his feelings, he apologized to you the next morning. Correct? Margaret's jaw tightened. He was confused. He told you it was a mistake. He told you it could never happen again. He didn't mean it. How do you know what he meant? Because I know him, Margaret snapped. Better than anyone. Better than Catherine ever did. Better than he knows himself. Sandra let that statement hang in the air. So you decided that you knew Richard Whitmore's feelings better than he did. And when he didn't act on those feelings, you decided to take matters into your own hands. I didn't. You cut his wife's brake lines. You killed her and made it look like an accident. She was in the way, Margaret said, her voice rising. And then, when Richard still didn't turn to you romantically, you started poisoning his son. I wasn't poisoning him. You were putting toxic insects into a 7-year-old boy's throat. You watched him convulse and vomit blood night after night. Is that not poisoning? Margaret's composure cracked. I was making myself necessary, she shouted. I was showing him that I was the only one who would never leave. The nannies all ran away. The doctors couldn't help. But I stayed. I always stayed. You stayed because you were the one causing his suffering. I was the one ending his suffering. Margaret slammed her hand on the witness stand. Every time I comforted him, every time I held him through the terror, he looked at me like I was his savior. And Richard saw it. He saw how much his son needed me. Sandra stepped back, letting the jury absorb Margaret's words. So you tortured a child to make his father dependent on you. Margaret's eyes were wild now, all pretense of calm gone. I loved him. Everything I did was for love. I gave that family 10 years of my life. I cooked and cleaned and served while they treated me like I was invisible. I deserved to be seen. I deserved to be loved. And Catherine Whitmore, did she deserve to die? Margaret went very still. Catherine, she said slowly, got exactly what she deserved. She had everything I wanted, and she didn't even appreciate it. She complained about Richard constantly. She threatened to leave him. She didn't love him, not really, not like I did. So you decided she should die. Margaret smiled a cold, terrible smile that made several jurors visibly shudder. I decided she should stop standing in the way of fate. Sandra Chen looked at the jury. No further questions. The closing arguments lasted 2 hours. The defense begged for compassion, for understanding of mental illness, for a recognition that Margaret Collins was sick and needed treatment, not punishment. The prosecution asked for justice. This is not a case of mental illness, Sandra said. This is a case of obsession, entitlement, and calculated cruelty. Margaret Collins didn't snap one day and commit a crime of passion. She planned. She researched. She waited. She murdered a woman and spent 2 years poisoning a child, all because she believed she deserved something that was never hers. Sandra turned to face Margaret directly. She is not sick. She is dangerous. And if you do not remove her from society permanently, she will find another target for her obsession, another family to destroy, another innocent child to torture. She faced the jury one final time. Richard Whitmore lost his wife. His son nearly lost his life. All because this woman could not accept that love cannot be forced. Justice demands accountability. Justice demands that Margaret Collins never have the opportunity to hurt anyone again. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder for Catherine Whitmore. Attempted murder for Ethan Whitmore. Aggravated assault. Child endangerment. Tampering with evidence. Margaret Collins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Richard didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He felt hollow. Catherine was still dead. Ethan was still traumatized. And nothing, not guilty verdicts, not prison sentences, not justice itself, could undo the damage Margaret had caused. Amara found him outside the courthouse, standing alone on the steps. "It's over," she said quietly. Richard shook his head. "It's not over. It'll never be over. I have to go home and tell my son that the woman who raised him for 5 years is going to prison forever. I have to explain why his mother really died. I have to help him understand something that I can't even understand myself." Amara stood beside him, not touching, just present. "You won't have to do it alone," she said. Richard turned to look at her. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you still here? The trial is done. Ethan is safe. You could walk away right now and never look back." Amara was quiet for a moment. "When I lost my nursing license," she said slowly, "I thought my life was over. I had spent 5 years building a career helping people, making a difference. And then one day it was all gone. I was blacklisted, unemployable. I had to take whatever work I could find, just to pay rent." She looked out at the city, at the cars passing by, and the people going about their ordinary lives. "I spent 2 years angry, bitter, convinced that the world was unfair, and that nothing I did would ever matter again." She turned back to Richard. "And then I walked into your house, and I heard a little boy screaming, and I realized that my skills, my experience, my ability to notice what others miss, none of that was gone. It was just waiting for the right moment." Her voice softened. "I stayed because Ethan needed help. But I'm still here because for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I have a purpose. Like I'm not just surviving, but actually living." Richard felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen since the moment he watched Margaret put that insect in Ethan's mouth. Something that might, with time, become warmth again. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father to a traumatized child. I don't know how to grieve a wife whose death I couldn't prevent. I don't know how to trust anyone ever again." Amara nodded slowly. "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to take it one day at a time. And on the days when it's too hard to do alone, you let the people who care about you help carry the weight." Richard looked at her. This woman who had appeared in his life by chance and changed everything. "Would you come with me?" he asked. "To pick up Ethan. He's been asking about you all week." Amara smiled softly. "Of course." They walked down the courthouse steps together into a future that was uncertain and painful and terrifying. But for the first time in months, Richard didn't feel completely alone, and that he realized was the first step toward healing. The drive home from the courthouse was silent. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind still replaying Margaret's words on the witness stand. The cold smile when she talked about Catherine. The wild desperation when she justified poisoning Ethan. The absolute conviction that everything she had done was an act of love. Amara sat in the passenger seat, not speaking, not filling the silence with empty words. She understood that some moments required quiet. Some wounds needed space to breathe before they could begin to heal. When they pulled up to the mansion, Richard didn't get out immediately. He stared at the house. The massive stone facade, the perfectly manicured hedges, the windows that had witnessed so much horror. "I can't live here anymore," he said quietly. Amara turned to look at him. "This house," Richard continued, his voice hollow. "Catherine picked it out. She loved the garden, the view of the hills, the space for Ethan to run around. We were supposed to grow old here together." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But now when I look at it all, I see as Margaret. Her standing over Ethan's bed. Her walking through these hallways pretending to care for us while she planned my wife's murder. I can't sleep here. I can't eat here. I can't raise my son in a place where every room reminds me of what she did." Amara nodded slowly. "Then don't." Richard looked at her. "What?" "Sell it," Amara said simply. "Buy something new. Something that doesn't have her fingerprints on every surface. It's worth millions. The market, the timing." "Richard." Amara's voice was gentle but firm. "You're one of the wealthiest men in Austin. Money is not your problem. Your problem is that your son wakes up screaming in the same room where a woman tortured him for months. Your problem is that you walk past the library where you made a mistake that spiraled into murder. Your problem is that this house is a prison, not a home." She reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "Get out. Start fresh. Give Ethan and yourself a chance to heal somewhere that isn't haunted by the past." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed his real estate agent. "It's Richard Whitmore," he said. "I want to list the Westlake Hills property. Immediately." The house sold in 3 weeks. A tech executive from California paid cash well above asking price. He didn't care about the history. He didn't know about the trial or the murder or the insects. To him, it was just a beautiful mansion with a stunning view. Richard didn't tell him the truth. He figured some things were better left buried. While the sale was processing, Richard began looking for a new home. He drove through neighborhoods he had never considered before, modest areas with normal-sized houses and families who didn't have live-in staff or 9,000 square feet of marble floors. It was Ethan who found their new house. They were driving through a quiet neighborhood in North Austin when Ethan suddenly shouted from the back seat, "Dad, stop! Look at that one!" Richard pulled over and followed his son's pointing finger. It was a simple 2-story home with white siding, blue shutters, and a big oak tree in the front yard. A tire swing hung from one of the branches, swaying gently in the breeze. "What do you like about it, buddy?" Richard asked. Ethan pressed his face against the window. "It looks like a happy house," he said. "Like the kind of house where nothing bad happens." Richard's throat tightened. They bought it the next day. Moving took less time than Richard expected. He left most of the furniture behind. It belonged to the old life, the old house, the old nightmare. He kept only the things that mattered. Catherine's photographs, Ethan's toys, the books she used to read aloud before bed. Everything else could be replaced. The new house had 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and windows that let in more sunlight than the mansion ever had. It felt exposed, at first vulnerable, without the high walls and security gates Richard had grown accustomed to. But it also felt free. On the first night in the new house, Ethan asked if Amara was coming. Richard hesitated. "She has her own apartment, buddy. She doesn't live with us." Ethan's face fell. "But I want her to." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Ethan crossed his arms, his expression stubborn. "She helped me when I was sick. She makes me feel safe. And you like her. I can tell." Richard opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. His 7-year-old had just cut through all of his adult complications with one simple truth. "Let me talk to her," Richard said finally. "But I can't promise anything." Ethan smiled for the first time in days. "I know she'll say yes." The next morning, Richard drove to Amara's apartment. It was a small unit in a modest complex, nothing like the mansion she had worked in, nothing like the life Richard took for granted. He stood outside her door for a full minute before knocking, trying to figure out what to say. Amara opened the door in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked surprised to see him. "Richard, is everything okay? Is Ethan?" "He's fine," Richard said quickly. "He's great, actually. He asked about you this morning. He wants to know if you're coming to the new house." Amara leaned against the doorframe. "I was planning to visit this weekend. Help you unpack. Maybe cook dinner." "He doesn't want to visit." Richard took a breath. "He wants you to stay." Amara's expression shifted. "Stay." "The new house has a guest suite," Richard said. "Private entrance, separate bathroom, plenty of space. I'm not asking you to be a nanny or a housekeeper or an employee. I'm asking you to be part of this." Amara didn't respond immediately. "Richard, Before you say no, hear me out." He stepped closer. "Ethan has been through hell. He lost his mother. He was poisoned by someone he trusted. He's going to need stability, consistency, people around him who actually care about his well-being. And right now, you're one of the only people on this planet he trusts completely." Amara's eyes glistened. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "What do you need?" Richard was silent for a moment. "I need help," he admitted. I've spent the last few months barely holding myself together. I don't know how to be a single father. I don't know how to help Ethan process his trauma. I don't know how to move forward when everything behind me is wreckage. He met her eyes. I'm not asking for forever. I'm not asking for commitment. I'm just asking for now, today, tomorrow. One day at a time until we figure out what comes next. Amara studied his face for a long moment. No strings? She asked. No strings. I get my own space. Completely private. And if I decide to leave... Richard's chest tightened, but he nodded. Then you leave. No guilt, no pressure, no expectations. Amara was quiet. Then slowly she smiled. Okay, she said. I'll stay. The adjustment was easier than Richard expected. Amara moved into the guest suite within the week. She kept her own hours, her own space, her own routine. She wasn't a servant or a subordinate. She was a partner in recovery, someone who showed up when needed and stepped back when appropriate. With Ethan, she was patient and warm and endlessly creative. She played dinosaur games that lasted for hours. She helped him with homework without making him feel stupid. She sat with him during his therapy sessions, waiting in the lobby with a book ready to take him for ice cream afterward, regardless of how difficult the session had been. And slowly, miraculously, Ethan began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. The flinching at sudden movements faded. The hollow look in his eyes was replaced by something brighter, something alive. 3 months after the move, Ethan joined a youth soccer team. Richard stood on the sidelines for the first practice, watching his son run and laugh and interact with other kids his age. It was such a normal sight, something millions of parents witnessed every weekend, but to Richard, it felt like a resurrection. Amara appeared beside him holding 2 cups of coffee. He scored a goal, she said, handing him one. I saw. Richard's voice was thick. He's never played organized sports before. Catherine and I always meant to sign him up, but we kept putting it off and then... He trailed off. Amara sipped her coffee. He's a natural, good footwork, lots of energy. He gets that from his mother. Richard paused. She was a dancer in college. Did I ever tell you that... You mentioned it once. Catherine. Richard said her name aloud, something he hadn't done in months. She would have loved this. Seeing him run around making friends, being a normal kid. Amara was quiet, letting him talk. I've spent so long being angry, Richard continued. Angry at Margaret. Angry at myself. Angry at the universe for letting this happen. But watching him out there, I just feel grateful. He turned to look at Amara. Grateful that he survived. Grateful that you found the truth. Grateful that we have a chance to start over. Amara smiled softly. That's progress. Is it? Absolutely. She nudged his shoulder. 6 months ago, you couldn't even say Catherine's name without falling apart. Now you're talking about her with love, instead of just grief. That's healing, Richard. Richard considered this. I'm still angry, he admitted. When I think about Margaret, I still want to... He stopped himself. I know, Amara said. That anger might never go away completely. But it doesn't have to control you. It can just be something you carry, something that reminds you to protect the people you love. Richard looked back at the field where Ethan was high-fiving a teammate. How did you get so wise? He asked. Amara laughed, a genuine warm sound that made Richard's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Trauma, she said dryly. Lots and lots of trauma. That night, after Ethan was in bed, Richard found Amara in the kitchen studying for her nursing exams. She had enrolled in a reinstatement program at the University of Texas, working to get her license back. Richard had offered to pay the tuition. She had refused, insisting on taking out loans instead. They had compromised on Richard covering her living expenses so she could focus on school without working a second job. "How's it going?" Richard asked, pouring himself a glass of water. Amara rubbed her eyes. "Pharmacology is going to kill me. I knew this stuff 5 years ago, but it's like my brain decided to delete it all." "You'll get it back." Richard sat across from her. "You're the smartest person I know." Amara snorted. "You're biased." "Maybe." He smiled. "Doesn't make it less true." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. Amara looked up. "Sure." "When you first came to the mansion, did you have any idea what you were walking into?" Amara closed her textbook. "Honestly, no. I knew there was a sick child. I knew nannies kept quitting. But I figured it was just a difficult medical situation, maybe a wealthy family that didn't know how to handle stress." She leaned back in her chair. "The first time I heard Ethan screaming, though, something felt wrong. Not wrong like, oh no, that poor kid, wrong like, this doesn't add up. The timing was too precise. The symptoms were too specific. And Margaret..." Her expression darkened. "Margaret watched me from the first day. Not suspiciously, more like she was sizing me up, figuring out if I was a threat." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "She knew you were investigating." "I think she suspected, but she underestimated me." Amara's voice hardened. "People always underestimate me. I'm a black woman with a cleaning cart. They assume I'm invisible, that I don't notice things, that I'm not smart enough to be dangerous." She met Richard's eyes. "Margaret's biggest mistake was thinking I was just the help." Richard nodded slowly. "I'm glad she underestimated you," he said quietly. "If she hadn't, Ethan might be dead." Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew how close it had been. Months passed. Ethan turned 8. They threw him a birthday party in the backyard, a small gathering with his soccer teammates and a few kids from school. Amara made a dinosaur-shaped cake that looked like it had survived an asteroid impact, which Ethan declared the most awesome cake ever. Richard watched the chaos from the porch, marveling at how different this was from birthdays past. At the mansion, Catherine had always hired professional party planners. Elaborate themes, rented equipment, catered food. The parties were perfect and polished and completely joyless. This was loud and messy and absolutely wonderful. "He seems happy," Amara said, appearing beside him with a plate of cake. "He is happy." Richard accepted the plate. "Happier than I've seen him in years, maybe ever." Amara watched Ethan chase his friends around the oak tree. "Kids are resilient," she said. "More resilient than we give them credit for. He's going to be okay, Richard." "What about me?" Richard asked, half joking. "Am I going to be okay?" Amara turned to look at him. "That depends," she said. "Are you actually doing the work?" "Therapy, self-reflection, processing what happened." Richard grimaced. "I've been to 3 sessions. 3 in 6 months. I know. He held up his hands. "It's hard. Sitting there talking about my feelings, it doesn't come naturally." "Does anything important come naturally?" Amara challenged. "Ethan goes to therapy twice a week. He works hard every single session. If a 8-year-old can do it, so can you." Richard sighed. "You're right. I'm always right." Amara grinned. "You should know that by now." He laughed despite himself. And for a moment, just a moment, everything felt almost normal. That night after the party, after the guests had gone home and Ethan had crashed in a sugar coma, Richard found himself sitting alone in the backyard. The stars were bright overhead. The neighborhood was quiet. The tire swing swayed gently in the breeze. He thought about Catherine. Not the Catherine who died, the Catherine who lived. The woman who laughed too loud at her own jokes. The woman who cried at every Disney movie. The woman who argued with him about politics and challenged him to be better and loved him even when he didn't deserve it. He missed her. He would always miss her. But for the first time since her death, the missing didn't feel like drowning. It felt like remembering. "Mind if I join you?" Richard looked up to see Amara standing at the back door. "Please," he said. She sat down on the porch step beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Ethan's out cold," she reported. "I checked on him 3 times. He's fine. Thank you for everything today. The cake, the decorations wrangling 15 hyperactive children." Amara waved her hand. "It was fun. I haven't thrown a kid's birthday party since my nephew turned 5. "You have a nephew?" "2 nephews and a niece. My sister's kids. They live in Dallas. I don't see them as much as I'd like." Richard realized suddenly how little he knew about Amara's life outside of this house. "Tell me about them," he said. Amara smiled. "The oldest is Marcus. He's 12 now, obsessed with basketball, thinks he's going to be the next LeBron. Then there's Destiny. She's 9, quietest kid you've ever met, but smart as a whip. And the baby is Jalen. He just turned 6. He's a handful." "Do they know what you've been doing, the whole situation?" "Some of it." Amara's expression softened. "My sister doesn't watch the news, but she saw the trial coverage. She called me crying, said she couldn't believe I'd been living in a house with a murderer." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I didn't know until it was almost too late. That I got lucky." Amara paused. "That I found something worth fighting for." Richard looked at her. The moonlight caught her features, the curve of her cheekbones, the strength in her jaw, the depth in her eyes that came from surviving things no one should have to survive. She was beautiful. He had known this for months, had felt the pull toward her growing stronger with each passing day. But he had kept it buried, convinced himself it was gratitude or proximity, or the natural result of shared trauma. Now sitting beside her under the stars, he couldn't pretend anymore. "Amara," he said quietly. She turned to face him. "I need to tell you something." Her expression shifted, cautious but open. "Okay." Richard took a breath. "When you first came to the mansion, I barely noticed you. I was so consumed with Ethan's illness, so overwhelmed by everything falling apart, that I didn't see you as a person. You were just someone who cleaned the floors." Amara didn't react. She just listened. "But then you started paying attention. You started asking questions everyone else missed. You noticed things that 7 nannies and a dozen doctors overlooked. And I realized this woman is extraordinary. This woman is seeing what I'm too blind to see." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When you pulled that insect out of Ethan's throat, when you looked at Margaret and accused her of putting it there in that moment, I knew my son's life was saved. But it was more than that. You gave me the truth about Catherine. You gave me answers I didn't even know I needed." His voice cracked slightly. "And somewhere in the middle of all that horror, I started feeling something I didn't expect. Something I wasn't prepared for." Amara's breath had grown shallow. "Richard." "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not expecting you to feel the same way. But I can't keep pretending that my feelings for you are just gratitude or friendship or whatever I've been telling myself. It's more than that. You're more than that." Amara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand. "I know," she said softly. "I've known for a while." Richard's heart lurched. "You have—" "Richard? You look at me like I hung the moon. You find excuses to be in whatever room I'm in. You laugh at jokes I make that aren't even funny." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not blind." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Amara sighed. "Because I wasn't sure if it was real. You've been through so much, the betrayal, the murder, the trial. People develop feelings for the people who help them through crises. It's called trauma bonding. I didn't want to be your rebound from horror." Richard shook his head. "That's not what this is." "How do you know?" "Because I've been thinking about it constantly, analyzing it, trying to talk myself out of it. And every time I come to the same conclusion." He turned to face her fully. "This isn't gratitude. This isn't proximity. This is you, Amara. Who you are. The way you think, the way you care, the way you refuse to back down from anything. I've never met anyone like you." Amara's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared that if we try this and it doesn't work, I'll lose everything. This house, Ethan, you all of it." "You won't lose anything," Richard said firmly. "Whatever happens, you'll always have a place in our lives. You're family now. Nothing changes that." Amara studied his face, searching for doubt or hesitation. She found none. "Slow," she said finally. "What? If we do this, it has to be slow. No rushing, no grand gestures, no announcing it to the world. We take it one step at a time and see where it goes." Richard nodded immediately. "Slow, whatever pace you need. And Ethan can't know, not yet. Not until we're sure this is real." "Agreed." Amara took a deep breath. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. Okay." She smiled, nervous, hopeful, real. "Let's see where this goes." Richard lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for taking a chance on me." Amara laughed softly. "Don't thank me yet. I haven't even told you about my terrible morning breath." Richard grinned. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, the future felt full of possibility. And as they sat together under the stars, hands intertwined, neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. But they knew they would face it together. And sometimes that was enough. A year and a half passed like water through open hands, sometimes rushing, sometimes trickling, but always moving forward. Richard learned to wake up without dread. He learned to walk through his house without checking every shadow. He learned to laugh at dinner tables and cheer at soccer games and fall asleep without nightmares clawing at his chest. It wasn't easy. Some days, the grief still crashed over him, without warning. A song on the radio that Catherine used to love, a photograph he stumbled across, while cleaning the anniversary of her death that arrived each year like a knife to the ribs. On those days, he let himself feel it. He didn't push it down or drink it away or pretend everything was fine. He just sat with the pain until it passed. Amara taught him that. She taught him that grief wasn't something to be conquered, it was something to be carried. And the weight of it grew lighter with time, not because he forgot, but because he built the strength to bear it. Ethan turned 9 in October. The birthday party was smaller this year. Just his closest friends, a backyard barbecue, and a cake shaped like a velociraptor that Amara had spent 3 days perfecting. Richard manned the grill while Ethan and his friends played capture the flag in the yard, their shouts echoing off the oak trees. "He's so different now," Richard said quietly, watching his son tackle a teammate and collapse into giggles. Amara appeared beside him holding a plate of hamburger buns. "Different how?" "Just alive." Richard flipped a burger, his eyes still on Ethan. "Do you remember what he was like when you first came to the mansion? He barely spoke. He never smiled. He looked like a ghost wearing a child's skin." Amara nodded. "I remember. And now look at him." Richard's voice caught. "He's captain of his soccer team. He got straight A's last semester. He has friends, real friends, who come over after school and make too much noise and eat all our snacks." He turned to face Amara. "You did that. You gave him his childhood back." Amara shook her head. "We did it together. You, me, his therapist, his teachers. It took a village. But you were the one who saw what everyone else missed. You were the one who saved his life when I was too blind to see what was happening." Amara set down the plate and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Richard, I need you to hear something. Really hear it, not just nod and move on." He met her eyes. "I'm listening. What happened to Ethan wasn't your fault. What happened to Catherine wasn't your fault. Margaret Collins made her own choices, and those choices were born from sickness and obsession, not from anything you did or didn't do." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Amara held up her hand. "I know you've been to therapy. I know you've done the work. But I also know you're still carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. I see it sometimes, the way you flinch when Ethan coughs, the way you check his room 3 times before bed, the way you tense up whenever someone new comes into his life. She cupped his face in her hands. You're a good father. You were always a good father. The only person who failed Ethan was Margaret, and she's rotting in prison where she belongs. You have to let go of the rest. Richard's eyes burned. I'm trying, he whispered. I know. Amara kissed his forehead gently. And that's all anyone can ask. That evening, after the party wound down, and the last of Ethan's friends had been picked up by their parents, Richard found his son sitting on the tire swing, looking up at the stars. Room for one more, Richard asked. Ethan nodded, scooting over even though the swing was barely big enough for him alone. Richard wedged himself in beside his son, their legs dangling, the rope creaking under their combined weight. Good birthday? Richard asked. The best. Ethan grinned. Tyler said my house is the coolest because we have a tire swing. And Marcus said Amara's cake was better than any bakery cake he's ever had, and Sophie tried to kiss me behind the oak tree, but I ran away. Richard laughed. Sophie tried to kiss you. She's weird. Ethan wrinkled his nose. Girls are weird. They definitely are. They swung gently in the darkness, the chains squeaking a quiet rhythm. Dad, Ethan said after a moment. Yeah, buddy. Can I ask you something? Anything. Ethan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Do you love Amara? Richard's heart stuttered. He and Amara had been so careful to keep their relationship private. No kissing in front of Ethan. No sleeping in the same room. No overt displays of affection that might confuse or upset him. But apparently, they hadn't been careful enough. Why do you ask? Richard said, buying time. Ethan shrugged. I see how you look at her. It's the same way Jacob's dad looks at his mom. And you smile more when she's around. And sometimes when you think I'm not watching, you hold her hand. Richard took a deep breath. Yes, he said finally. I love her very much. Ethan nodded, not surprised. Does she love you back? I think so. I hope so. Another pause. Is she going to be my new mom? The question hit Richard like a punch to the chest. Amara would never try to replace your mother, he said carefully. Nobody could ever replace Mom. She was special and amazing, and she loved you more than anything in the world. I know. Ethan's voice was small. I still miss her. Me too, buddy. Every single day. But, Ethan hesitated. Would it be wrong if I loved Amara too? Not like a replacement mom. Just like Amara? Richard pulled his son closer. That wouldn't be wrong at all. He said, his voice thick. Your heart is big enough to love lots of people. Loving Amara doesn't mean you love Mom any less. It just means your family is growing. Ethan leaned his head against Richard's shoulder. I want her to stay forever, he said quietly. I don't want her to leave like the others. She's not going anywhere, Richard promised. She's part of our family now. That's not going to change. You promise? Richard kissed the top of his son's head. I promise. 2 months later, Amara passed her nursing reinstatement exams. Richard came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table staring at her laptop screen with tears streaming down her face. Amara. He dropped his briefcase and rushed to her side. What's wrong? What happened? She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of shock and joy. I passed, she whispered. I passed everything. They're reinstating my license. Richard felt his heart expand. You passed. I passed. Amara laughed through her tears. After 5 years of fighting, 5 years of being told I'd never work as a nurse again, I passed. Richard pulled her into his arms and held her tight. I knew you could do it, he murmured into her hair. I never doubted you for a second. I doubted myself. Amara pulled back to look at him. There were so many nights I wanted to give up. The material was overwhelming. The exams were brutal, and every time I walked into that testing center, I felt like a fraud pretending to be a nurse. But you didn't give up. No, she smiled. I had too much to lose. Ethan burst through the front door, at that moment his backpack bouncing. I'm home. What's for dinner? Can I watch TV before homework? Tyler said. He stopped seeing Amara's tear-streaked face. What happened? Are you okay? Amara knelt down to his level. I'm better than okay, she said. I'm going to be a nurse again. Ethan's eyes went wide. For real? For real? He threw his arms around her neck. That's so cool. Does this mean you can give me stitches if I get hurt? Amara laughed. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Can I tell my friend Sophie's mom is a nurse too? Maybe you could work together. Sure, you can tell. But Ethan was already running upstairs, shouting about all the people he needed to inform. Amara stood up, shaking her head. That kid has more energy than a nuclear reactor. Gets it from his mother, Richard said softly. Catherine was the same way. Never could sit still, always had to be doing something. Amara reached for his hand. Do you think she would have approved of me, I mean? Being part of your lives? Richard considered the question seriously. Catherine was the most generous person I ever knew, he said. She never judged people by where they came from or what they'd been through. She cared about who they were deep down. He squeezed Amara's hand. She would have loved you. I'm absolutely certain of it. Amara's eyes glistened. I wish I could have met her. Me too. Richard pulled her close. But I think in some way she's still here, watching over us, grateful that Ethan has someone like you in his life. They stood together in the kitchen, holding each other as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan was excitedly video calling his friends. And in that moment, the house didn't feel like a place of recovery anymore. It felt like home. Spring arrived with blooming flowers and longer days. Amara started her new job at Austin Memorial Hospital, a different hospital than the one that had destroyed her career, but close enough to feel like a homecoming. She worked the early shift, leaving before dawn and returning in the afternoon, her scrubs often stained with coffee and her feet aching from 12 hours on the floor. But she loved it. She loved being back in the chaos of the ER, making split-second decisions, helping people on the worst days of their lives. She loved the camaraderie with her fellow nurses, the satisfaction of a successful save, the exhausted triumph at the end of a hard shift. For the first time in 5 years, she felt whole. Richard adjusted his work schedule to accommodate her hours. He dropped Ethan off at school in the mornings and worked from home in the afternoons, building a rhythm that felt sustainable and real. They ate dinner together every night, the three of them around the kitchen table, sharing stories about their days, arguing about what to watch on TV, bickering over whose turn it was to do dishes. It was ordinary. It was everything. One Saturday in late April, Richard woke up before anyone else. He lay in bed for a while, listening to the birds outside his window, thinking about how different his life was now. 18 months ago, he had been a broken man, living in a haunted mansion, watching his son die by inches while a monster hid in plain sight. Now, he was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. The realization still surprised him sometimes. Happiness had felt impossible for so long, a destination he could see on the horizon, but never reach. And yet, here he was. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because he had learned to carry it alongside the joy. He got out of bed quietly and went to his closet. In the back, hidden behind a row of suits, was a small velvet box. He had bought the ring 2 months ago. He had looked at dozens before finding the right one. A simple band of white gold with a modest diamond, elegant and understated. Nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious. Just beautiful like her. He hadn't told anyone about the ring. Not his friends, not his therapist, not even Ethan. He had been waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right certainty that this wasn't too fast or too soon. But as he held the box in his hands, He realized he had been certain for a long time. He just hadn't been ready to admit it. Today, he decided. Today was the day. Richard made breakfast for everyone: pancakes, bacon, fresh squeezed orange juice. Amara came downstairs in her bathrobe, still half asleep, and raised an eyebrow at the spread. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "No occasion." Richard handed her a cup of coffee. "Just felt like cooking." "You never feel like cooking." "Maybe I'm turning over a new leaf." Amara studied him suspiciously, but accepted the coffee without further comment. Ethan bounded downstairs moments later, drawn by the smell of bacon. "Pancakes, yes." He slid into his seat. "Can I have extra syrup?" "You can have a reasonable amount of syrup," Richard said. "That's not a yes." "It's not a no either." After breakfast, Richard suggested they spend the day outside. "It's beautiful out," he said. "We could go to the park, maybe have a picnic lunch." Amara looked at him strangely. "A picnic? Why not, Ethan? What do you think? Can I bring my soccer ball?" "Absolutely." "Then yes." They packed sandwiches and fruit and a blanket and drove to their favorite park, a sprawling green space with walking trails and a pond where ducks gathered to beg for breadcrumbs. Ethan immediately ran off to kick his ball around, leaving Richard and Amara to spread the blanket under a massive oak tree. "You're being weird today," Amara said, sitting down. "Weird how?" "I don't know. Nervous. Like you're planning something." Richard's heart rate spiked. "Planning something like what?" "I don't know." Amara narrowed her eyes. "That's what worries me." Richard forced a laugh. "I'm not planning anything. Can't a man just want to spend a nice day with his family?" "A man can," Amara said slowly. "But you're fidgeting. You've checked your pocket 3 times since we got here, and you keep looking at me like you're about to give a speech." Damn. She was too observant. Always had been. "Fine," Richard said. "There is something I want to talk to you about." Amara's expression shifted, still cautious but open. "Okay. I'm listening." Richard took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. He had planned the perfect words, the perfect delivery, the perfect romantic gesture. But now, sitting beside her, under this tree, watching Ethan chase ducks by the pond, all of his prepared speeches evaporated. So, he just spoke from the heart. "When you first came into my life," he began, "I was drowning. My son was dying. My wife had been murdered. I was surrounded by people, but I had never felt more alone." Amara didn't interrupt. She just listened. "And then there was you. This woman who was supposed to clean my floors and stay invisible, but instead you saw everything. You saw what 7 nannies missed, what a dozen doctors missed, what I missed, even though I lived in that house every day." Richard's voice grew thick. "You saved my son, Amara. But more than that, you saved me. You showed me that it was possible to trust again, to hope again, to love again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. Amara's breath caught. "I'm not asking because of gratitude," Richard said quickly. "And I'm not asking because of everything we've been through together. I'm asking because when I imagine my future, when I picture growing old, when I think about who I want beside me for the rest of my life, I only see you." He opened the box, revealing the ring inside. "You told me once that we had to take things slow, that you needed time to be sure this was real. It's been 18 months, Amara. I've never been more sure of anything." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not asking for an answer today," Richard continued. "I'm not asking for a timeline. I'm just asking you to consider spending the rest of your life with me, as my partner, as Ethan's family, as the woman I love more than I ever thought I could love anyone again." He paused, his heart pounding. "Will you marry me?" For a long moment, Amara didn't speak. She stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling in her lap. Then she looked up at him. "You really want this?" she whispered. "You want to spend your life with a woman who cleans houses for a living, a woman who lost everything, and had to build herself back from nothing. "I want to spend my life with you," Richard said firmly. "Not the version of you that existed before we met. Not some idealized image of who you might become. You, Amara, exactly as you are. Flawed and brilliant and stubborn and beautiful." He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "I love you. All of you. And if you'll let me, I'll spend every day of my life proving it." Amara let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I told myself this would happen," she said. "I told myself you were building toward something, but I convinced myself it was too good to be true, that something would go wrong, that you'd wake up one day and realize you'd made a mistake." "Never," Richard said. "Not ever." Amara looked at the ring again. Then she looked at Richard. Then she looked across the park at Ethan, who had abandoned the ducks and was now trying to climb a tree. "Yes," she said. Richard's heart stopped. "Yes. Yes." Amara laughed through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll spend my life with you. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Richard slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had always belonged there. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her right there under the oak tree, in full view of the ducks and the joggers and anyone else who cared to watch. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too." Amara pulled back, her eyes shining. "Now we have to tell Ethan." "He already knows," Richard admitted. "He asked me about it months ago. I think he might be more excited than either of us." As if on cue, Ethan came sprinting across the grass. "Did you ask her? Did you ask her? Did she say yes?" Richard and Amara exchanged glances. "You told him?" Amara asked. "He figured it out on his own. Kid's too smart for his own good." Ethan skidded to a stop in front of them, his eyes locked on Amara's hand. "She's wearing the ring," he shouted. "That means yes. That means she's staying forever." He launched himself at Amara, nearly knocking her over, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I knew you'd say yes," he said, his voice muffled against her stomach. "I knew it. I told Dad you would." Amara held him tight, her chin resting on top of his head. "You were right, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." "Does this mean you're my mom now?" Amara hesitated, looking at Richard for guidance. He nodded gently. "I'd be honored to be your mom," Amara said softly. "If that's what you want." Ethan looked up at her with the biggest smile Richard had ever seen. "That's what I want," he said. "I want us to be a real family." "We already are," Richard said, kneeling down to join the embrace. "We've been a real family for a long time now. This just makes it official." They stayed like that for a long moment. The three of them tangled together on a blanket under an oak tree, the spring sun warming their faces. The future stretching out before them like an open road. Eventually, Ethan pulled away. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" he asked. Richard laughed. "Absolutely." "Can I get 2 scoops?" "Don't push your luck." They packed up the picnic and walked back to the car together. Ethan running ahead, Richard and Amara following hand in hand. "I can't believe this is my life," Amara said quietly. 2 years ago I was cleaning houses and wondering if I'd ever feel happy again. Now I'm engaged to a man I love with a son I adore and a career I thought I'd lost forever. "Life has a way of surprising us," Richard said. "Sometimes the surprises are horrible, but sometimes—" He squeezed her hand. "Sometimes they're everything you never knew you needed." They got ice cream at Ethan's favorite shop. He got 2 scoops anyway because Richard couldn't say no on a day like this. They sat at a picnic table outside, laughing and talking and planning a future that finally felt possible. And when they drove home as the sun began to set, Richard looked in the rearview mirror at his son, happy, healthy, alive, and then at the woman beside him, brilliant, brave, beautiful. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, Not the forgetting of loss, but the quiet certainty that despite everything, despite the murder and the betrayal and the months of horror, life had given him a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The wedding took place 6 months later in the backyard of their North Austin home. It was a small ceremony, just close friends Amara's family from Dallas, Richard's colleagues who had stood by him during the trial. Ethan served as ring bearer, beaming in his tiny suit, practically vibrating with excitement. When Amara walked down the makeshift aisle, Richard felt his knees go weak. She was wearing a simple white dress that caught the afternoon light. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Her smile was brighter than the sun. "You look incredible," Richard whispered as she reached him. "You look terrified," she whispered back. "I am, but in a good way." They exchanged vows they had written themselves. Richard spoke about loss and redemption, about the unexpected grace of finding love in the darkest moments. Amara spoke about resilience and hope, about the family she never expected to have, and the man who had shown her that trust was possible again. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan cheered louder than anyone. "I now have a mom and a dad," he announced to the assembled guests. "This is the best day ever." Everyone laughed. Amara knelt down to hug him. Richard wrapped his arms around them both. A photographer captured the moment the three of them tangled together, laughing and crying and holding on tight. It became the centerpiece of their living room, replacing the spot where Catherine's portrait had once hung. Not because Catherine was forgotten, but because life had moved forward. Because love had found a way to grow again. That night, after the guests had gone home and Ethan had finally crashed from exhaustion, Richard and Amara sat on the porch swing in their backyard. The same swing where he had proposed. The same swing where they had spent countless evenings talking about nothing and everything. "Mrs. Whitmore," Richard said, testing the name. "Mr. Johnson," Amara replied. Richard laughed. "I don't think that's how it works." "It works however we want it to work." Amara leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's the beauty of building your own family. You get to make the rules." They swung gently in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of traffic. "Do you ever think about Margaret?" Amara asked quietly. Richard stiffened slightly. "Sometimes. Less than I used to." "Me too." Amara was silent for a moment. "I wonder if she thinks about us. Sitting in her cell knowing that the family she tried to destroy is thriving." "I hope she does," Richard said. "I hope it haunts her every single day." "That's dark." "Maybe." He pulled Amara closer. "But she took 2 years of my son's life. She murdered my wife. She tried to turn me into her puppet. I think I'm entitled to a little darkness." Amara nodded slowly. "Fair enough." They fell silent again. Then Amara said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up. On Ethan, on yourself, on the possibility of happiness." She looked up at him. "There were so many moments when you could have surrendered to despair. So many moments when it would have been easier to stop fighting, but you kept going. You kept believing that things could get better." Richard shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You were there every step of the way." "We did it together," Amara agreed. "That's my point. We chose each other. We chose hope. We chose to build something beautiful out of the wreckage." She touched his face gently. "That's not nothing, Richard. That's everything." He kissed her, then slowly, deeply, with all the love he had been afraid to feel for so long. "I love you," he murmured. "I love you too." And as they sat together under the stars, the past finally where it belonged behind them, Richard understood something he had been too broken to see before. The story of his life wasn't defined by tragedy. It was defined by what he did after, by the choices he made, by the people he loved, by the family he built from ashes and hope and stubborn, defiant grace. Margaret Collins had tried to destroy him. She had failed. And now surrounded by the people who mattered most, Richard Whitmore knew with absolute certainty that the darkness was over. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because love, real love, hard-won and battle-tested, had proven stronger. It always did, it always would, and that was the only truth that mattered.